Get ready, because today is not simply another day waiting to pass. It marks a boundary in the story of your life, a moment when one direction gives way to another. And once that threshold is crossed, the old path cannot be restored in exactly the same way. For 19 months, you have been moving through one of the deepest spiritual cycles of your life, even if you could not always understand what was happening while you were inside it. During this period, the universe has steadily taken apart structures within you that once felt permanent. Beliefs were questioned, attachments weakened, illusions lost their power, and parts of your identity that you once depended on may have gradually dissolved. Today, the North Node officially leaves Pisces and moves into Aquarius, while at the same time the South Node shifts into Leo. A completely new 18-month chapter begins, and the symbolic compass directing the evolutionary movement of every soul on this planet is recalibrated. This is not a quiet adjustment that happens so slowly you barely notice it. It represents a sharp redirection, a change in the current beneath your life that can make the familiar feel strangely unfamiliar. And this is the part that should make you pause. Most people will wake up today, make their coffee, check their phones, follow the same schedule, and continue with ordinary routines without realizing that the larger trajectory of their lives is beginning to change. But you may already feel something different. You may have noticed an unusual inner pull lately, a strange sense that something is asking to be released, even though you cannot clearly identify what it is. Perhaps you have felt less attached to an old role, less willing to force situations into place, or increasingly aware that something inside you has outgrown the life you once considered normal. Do not dismiss that feeling simply because you cannot explain it logically. There is a reason it is appearing now, but before that meaning can become clear, you need to understand what this nodal transition is actually closing, and why the previous 19 months had to unfold the way they did. This shift is not happening in isolation. It arrives in the middle of one of the most volatile astrological months in years, surrounded by two eclipses that have already torn through the collective energetic field. The atmosphere has already been shaken, old emotional patterns have already been exposed, and the ground beneath familiar identities has already begun moving. Today changes the context of everything that has been happening. To understand where you are being directed, you first have to recognize where you have been. The 19 months that seemed to break you were not meaningless. They were part of a process. Since January 2025, the North Node has been traveling through Pisces, while the South Node has moved through Virgo. If you are completely honest with yourself, you already know what that period has felt like. It has been an experience of being overwhelmed and healed at the same time. The universe has spent the last year and a half dismantling an internal system built around control, correction, analysis, and constant self-monitoring. You may have spent years believing that if you worked harder, planned more carefully, organized everything more efficiently, and anticipated every possible problem, you could finally create enough certainty to feel safe. Yet the South Node in Virgo has steadily exposed the weakness hidden inside that strategy. It has shown you that perfectionism was not necessarily protecting you. Sometimes it was trapping you inside standards that could never be satisfied. The relentless inner critic that you believed kept you sharp may actually have been teaching you to make yourself smaller. The obsession with productivity may have looked like ambition from the outside, while underneath it functioned as a defense mechanism that kept you from fully experiencing your own emotions. If you were always fixing something, improving something, planning something, or analyzing something, you never had to sit completely still with what you were feeling. That is where Pisces entered the story. While Virgo demanded refinement, Pisces asked for surrender. While one side wanted measurable certainty, the other required trust in what could not be measured. The North Node in Pisces pushed you toward the uncomfortable territory of feeling instead of immediately repairing, imagining instead of cataloging, and allowing uncertainty to exist without treating it as proof that something had gone wrong. It asks you to discover that imperfection could become an opening rather than evidence of failure. For some people, this period felt like a spiritual awakening. For others, it felt like their carefully constructed life was collapsing around them. For many, it was impossible to separate the two experiences because the awakening happened through the collapse. What had to disappear was not necessarily your entire life, but the version of yourself that believed control was the only way to survive it. This is one of the hardest lessons of a Pisces transit, because the healing does not always arrive in the form of a clear answer. Sometimes the deeper transformation comes when you stop demanding an answer in the first place. The point was never to solve every mystery. The point was to become capable of living without needing every mystery solved before you could trust yourself. Dissolution became the medicine. The old certainty had to soften. The old identity had to loosen. The old habit of turning every feeling into a problem that needed to be managed had to lose its authority. And now, after 19 months of that process, the universe is no longer asking you to keep dissolving. The next phase begins today. The energy starts turning from surrender toward construction, from releasing what has expired toward discovering what can exist in its place. That transition becomes even more significant when you look at what has happened only 5 days ago. On August 12, a total solar eclipse occurred at 20 degrees Leo, and its impact was not limited to what could be observed in the sky. Symbolically, it moved through the emotional and psychological landscape of identity itself. A total solar eclipse near the South Node is regarded as one of the most intense cosmic events because it represents a temporary interruption of conscious light. A moment when the familiar sense of ego and personal certainty can become obscured. This particular eclipse occurred in Leo, the sign associated with identity, leadership, personal expression, and the self as it is presented to the world. For a brief period, the sun disappeared from view, and symbolically, the light represented by the sun, your will, your clarity, your confidence, and your understanding of who you believe yourself to be, was temporarily obscured. That is why the emotional impact of this period can feel so much deeper than an ordinary change of circumstances. When the light goes quiet, you are forced to notice what you were using that light to define. And that realization is where the next stage of this story begins. What emerges after an eclipse can be more revealing than what disappears during it. Because once the light returns, you begin to notice which parts of yourself were never truly meant to remain. In the silence created by that darkness, old patterns can rise again. Familiar identities can briefly demand your attention, and old ways of seeking approval can return as if they are asking for one final chance to control the story. These are the behaviors, identities, and validation patterns that no longer belong to the person you are becoming. The total solar eclipse was visible across the Arctic, Greenland, Iceland, and parts of Europe, reaching a maximum totality of a little more than 2 minutes. Yet those 2 minutes represented more than an astronomical event that people could observe and discuss. Symbolically, they functioned as a reset, a moment in which the structures surrounding identity were temporarily interrupted so that something deeper could be revealed. It is as though the universe pressed delete on the ego structures, ambitions, plans, and leadership patterns that depended primarily on charisma, attention, recognition, and applause. If you have felt unusually disoriented since then, if your sense of identity has become unstable, or if the way you understand yourself has shifted in a way you cannot easily explain, do not automatically interpret that discomfort as personal failure. The instability itself can be part of the clearing process. Something familiar may be losing its grip because it no longer matches the person emerging underneath it. You may find yourself questioning why you needed certain people to approve of you, why being noticed once felt so important, or why confidence sometimes had to be performed before it could actually be felt. The eclipse is doing precisely what this symbolic moment represents, clearing psychological ground so that today's nodal shift has a cleaner space in which to take root. The former version of you may have needed the spotlight. It may have measured worth through external recognition, approval, admiration, or the response of an audience. It may have learned to look confident, even when confidence was absent internally. That identity was not necessarily false in every respect, but it represented the entry price for the chapter that is now closing, and the eclipse has already collected that price. Now the story reaches the moment where the rules change. The spiritual dissolution associated with Pisces is coming to an end. The disruption of ego associated with the eclipse in Leo has already happened. Today, August 18th, the North Node mean moves into Aquarius at around 7:30 in the evening, establishing the collective within an entirely different paradigm. Some of you may have already felt this movement building weeks ago, and there is a specific reason for that sensation. The true node, which accounts for the real-time gravitational oscillation of the lunar orbit, briefly moved into Aquarius toward the end of July. Think of that earlier movement as the universe opening a door only slightly, allowing a current of Aquarius energy to enter before the larger transition arrived. You may have sensed that current without knowing what to call it. Perhaps your priorities began changing. Perhaps certain ambitions suddenly felt less meaningful, or perhaps you became more interested in something larger than your individual story. But today is different because the mean node crosses the threshold. The mean node represents the mathematically averaged and stabilized trajectory of the karmic axis. It does not fluctuate in the same way. When it changes signs, the movement becomes established. That distinction matters because what happens today is not merely a preview of what might come later. It is not a temporary glimpse of a future possibility. It represents the anchoring of a new reality that will shape the next 18 months of human evolution. And the psychological demand attached to that shift is almost the opposite of what you have been practicing. For 19 months, the universe has been asking you to feel more deeply. Now, it asks you to think differently. For 19 months, you have been learning surrender. Now, you are being pushed toward innovation. The movement from Pisces into Aquarius can be understood as a passage from the ocean into the wave, from the mystical realm into the role of the architect, from spiritual surrender toward collective intelligence. You are no longer being asked only to understand your inner world. You are being confronted with the question of what you can contribute to the larger field around you. And beneath the entire transition sits one question that will become increasingly difficult to avoid. Are you ready to move from the self toward the collective? This is also where the process becomes uncomfortable, because the South Node entering Leo is not simply an abstract astrological placement. It functions like a mirror, reflecting the moments when you have performed your life instead of fully inhabiting it. Leo, when expressed through its healthiest qualities, represents warmth, creativity, courage, generosity, and authentic self-expression. But the South Node does not primarily reveal the polished expression of a sign. It exposes the shadow, the habits that have become automatic, the reactions that may once have helped you feel important or secure, but eventually became unhealthy. In Leo, that shadow can appear as an endless hunger for applause, an almost desperate need to be seen, praised, chosen, admired, or confirmed by other people. Over the next 18 months, the collective is symbolically being pushed to examine power structures that depend upon personality worship. The charismatic leader who expects loyalty without genuinely earning it. The influencer whose entire identity is carefully constructed for public consumption. And the hero complex that turns everyone else into supporting characters within one person's personal story are all examples of the patterns that can come under scrutiny. The deeper issue is not simply whether someone receives attention. It is what happens when attention becomes the foundation of identity. When admiration disappears, what remains? When nobody applauds, do you still know who you are? When the audience leaves, can you still feel valuable without performing confidence for them? Those questions become increasingly important because Jupiter is currently transiting Leo, and Jupiter expands whatever it touches. Before the ego can be released, it can become visibly enlarged. That means the coming months may bring exaggerated personalities, dramatic struggles for power, spectacular attempts to seize authority, and displays of arrogance that become almost impossible to ignore on the world stage. What is inflated becomes easier to recognize, and what becomes impossible to ignore eventually becomes impossible to avoid confronting. This is how the next phase begins, by revealing exactly what can no longer survive under the new collective direction. Do not mistake what is becoming larger for something being rewarded, because the inflation of the ego is not necessarily a blessing, it is a spotlight. The universe is making the unhealthy dimensions of ego so obvious, so exaggerated, and so difficult to overlook that eventually people are forced to recognize what they can no longer support. What was once hidden beneath charm, confidence, influence, or performance becomes visible through excess. The purpose is not humiliation for its own sake. The purpose is recognition. Sometimes you cannot choose a different medicine until you are finally willing to admit that the old one is making you sick. That is why the amplification happening around Leo matters so much. When pride becomes excessive, when the hunger for recognition becomes impossible to satisfy, when someone needs constant admiration simply to feel real, the pattern eventually reveals its own emptiness. And if you have personally built parts of your life around being noticed, praised, admired, or placed at the center, this period should not be understood as punishment. It can become an unexpected form of freedom. Think about how much energy it takes to maintain an image. Think about the effort required to appear confident when you are uncertain, successful when you are exhausted, important when you secretly feel invisible. Every performance consumes something. Every time you need an audience to confirm your value, part of your energy becomes tied to the audience. The moment you no longer need that confirmation, that energy becomes available for something real. This is why that strange inner pull you have been feeling matters. Remember the feeling we mentioned earlier, that inexplicable sensation that something is asking you to release an attachment, even though you cannot clearly identify what you are supposed to let go of. This is the reason. You have been sensing the gravitational movement from Leo toward Aquarius before the transition fully arrives. Something deeper within you may already understand what your conscious mind is still trying to process. Your soul can sense a change in direction before your logical mind has gathered enough evidence to explain it. What is approaching is a 10-month mission to stop building monuments around personal glory and begin creating networks that contribute to something larger than yourself. Aquarius represents the visionary, the rebel, and the architect of systems. It is less concerned with deciding who receives the applause, and far more concerned with whether the structure actually works. That difference becomes one of the defining lessons of this new cycle. With the North Node entering Aquarius, the collective direction of growth points toward decentralization, technological ethics, collective intelligence, and innovation designed around greater equality. Over the next 18 months, 3 subjects are positioned to dominate global conversation: artificial intelligence, digital rights, and algorithmic transparency. The deeper question behind these subjects is not simply what technology can do. It is who controls it, who benefits from it, and whether the systems shaping modern life are designed to elevate humanity or concentrate power within institutions that already possess enormous influence. Questions surrounding ownership of digital commons, control of personal data, and authority over the algorithms that increasingly influence what people see, believe, purchase, and experience are no longer merely political arguments. Within the symbolic framework of this nodal cycle, they represent part of the spiritual curriculum of the era. Yet this transition is not limited to governments, corporations, technology, or global institutions. It reaches directly into your personal life. Aquarius asks you to discover your people, not your audience. There is a profound difference between the two. An audience watches you. A community builds with you. An audience may applaud your ideas. Your people challenge those ideas when they believe you can create something better. An audience sits in the stands. A network enters the field beside you. During the next 18 months, success is therefore measured differently. The most meaningful result may not be the strength of your individual resume or the size of your personal reputation. It may be the quality of the team you helped create, the health of the community you contributed to, and the resilience of the network you helped strengthen. If that idea makes a part of you uncomfortable, pay attention to that discomfort. The fear may be the South Node in Leo resisting the loss of the spotlight. It may be the part of you that still believes being valuable means being exceptional, visible, chosen, or personally celebrated. Releasing that need does not mean becoming insignificant. It means discovering that significance can exist without constant recognition. But there is another warning you need to hear, because Aquarius has a shadow of its own, and moving too far into it can create a different kind of disconnection. This transition is not simply a story about progress, technology, intelligence, and collective improvement. Aquarius can become cold when its ideals lose contact with human feeling. It can become detached, rigid, and so committed to an ideology that the individual person disappears beneath the needs of the collective. Over the next 18 months, the danger is therefore not only an inflated ego. The opposite danger is the complete absence of warmth. Imagine creating a system that is extraordinarily efficient, perfectly rational, beautifully optimized, and technically impressive, only to discover that it no longer understands the imperfect human beings it was created to serve. That is the balance this cycle asks you to learn. You are not being asked to destroy the fire of Leo. You are being asked to redirect it. Take the warmth, the courage, the creative force, and the ability to make another person feel genuinely recognized, and place those qualities inside the larger framework of Aquarius. Build movements that are structurally strong while remaining deeply human. Create communities where belonging does not require people to surrender their individuality. Learn how to combine independence with cooperation, personal expression with collective responsibility, and vision with compassion. If you move too far into Aquarius, you can become a theorist disconnected from the people you claim to serve. If you cling too tightly to Leo, you can become a performer disconnected from the wider world that needs your contribution. The real mastery is not choosing one sign and rejecting the other. It is learning how to integrate them. Your individuality gives the collective something unique, while the collective gives your individuality somewhere meaningful to serve. And this is not the first time humanity has encountered this kind of nodal transition. History has already shown what can happen when the North Node enters Aquarius, because each previous passage has coincided with periods in which the world was fundamentally reshaped. The pattern has appeared before, and the evidence of those transformations is where the next part of this story begins. The lunar nodes complete a full cycle in approximately 18.6 years, which means the past can become a powerful reference point for understanding the kind of collective movement that may now be returning. When we look back at previous periods, when the North Node traveled through Aquarius, a striking pattern appears. These periods were repeatedly associated with moments when established hierarchies weakened. Centralized authority was challenged, and new networks began changing the way people organize society. The previous Aquarius nodal window, from December 2007 through August 2009, coincided with the collapse of the global financial system, one of the most dramatic disruptions of economic power in generations. During that same period, a presidential campaign demonstrated how decentralized digital networks and grassroots participation could challenge established political structures, while social media moved rapidly into mainstream consciousness and permanently altered the way human beings communicate and connect. Before that, From May through November 1990, the Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet bloc began dissolving, and citizens across the world participated in decentralized movements demanding democratic forms of governance. Behind the visible political changes, another transformation was taking shape. The World Wide Web was laying architectural foundations for the digital collective that would eventually become inseparable from modern life. Go back even further, and the pattern continues. The transit from 1970 to 1972 aligned with the ratification of the 26th Amendment, expanding democratic participation by lowering the voting age. The transit from 1952 to 1953 coincided with the discovery of the double helix structure of DNA, revealing the biological network through which humanity itself is constructed. Again and again, when the North Node enters Aquarius, systems of concentrated authority come under pressure while networks become more influential. Power begins moving away from a small group and toward a broader collective. Advances in technology, communication, science, and collective organization begin rewriting assumptions that once appeared permanent. This is why the current transition deserves so much attention, because this time there is an additional force operating alongside the nodal movement that was not present in those earlier examples. Pluto is already in Aquarius. Pluto represents profound transformation, destruction, regeneration, and the exposure of structures that have reached the end of their usefulness. Now it occupies the same sign that the incoming North Node is entering. As these two forces converge throughout the next year and a half, building toward a powerful conjunction near the end of 2027, the Aquarian themes are not expected to remain quiet or peripheral. They become intensified. The pressure toward transformation becomes difficult to resist. The old world does not simply receive a minor adjustment. It begins breaking down at a deeper level, so that something fundamentally different can eventually grow in its place. Think of a forest after a fire. What appears to be destruction from the outside can become the beginning of another ecosystem. What has already reached the end of its natural life cannot remain simply because people are emotionally attached to it. And this brings us to another major turning point, August 28th. Today's nodal shift begins the new chapter, but it does not represent the end of the extraordinary astrological intensity surrounding this month. 10 days later, on August 28th, a partial lunar eclipse arrives in Pisces, and its visual and emotional impact may feel enormous. This is not being presented as a minor eclipse. Approximately 93 to 96% of the lunar disk will be covered by the Earth's shadow, making the event appear visually similar to a total eclipse. It will be visible across the Americas, Europe, and Africa, and the moon will take on the haunting reddish glow that has fascinated, inspired, and frightened civilizations throughout history. Yet the symbolism becomes even more significant because the eclipse occurs in Pisces. Pisces has been the landscape through which you have been moving since January 2025, and this eclipse functions as a final emotional closing ceremony for that chapter. Think about everything that has happened since then. Every lesson involving surrender. Every moment when something dissolved before you understood why. Every illusion that had to disappear before you could see more clearly. Every situation that forced you to stop controlling what could not be controlled. The eclipse becomes the symbolic final rinse of that entire process. Whatever emotional residue remains, whatever unfinished pain continues to cling to you, whatever confusion you have carried through this Pisces period, it can be brought closer to the surface so that it can finally be released. That does not mean the experience will necessarily feel gentle. Full moon eclipses rarely feel emotionally neutral, and this one may bring waves of feeling that seem to arrive without an obvious explanation. Old memories may return unexpectedly, almost like fragments of wreckage appearing after a powerful storm. You may find yourself crying without immediately understanding the reason. You may experience a profound fatigue that feels deeper than ordinary physical tiredness, as though the exhaustion has reached into the emotional layers beneath your daily life. But the purpose of bringing these things forward is not to trap you inside them. The purpose is to clear the fog. Sometimes clarity cannot be forced through analysis. Sometimes you only understand what something meant after you finally stop carrying it. What emerges after the emotional release is the kind of clarity that becomes possible only when the atmosphere inside you has become quiet enough to see what was previously hidden. And that clarity becomes part of what you carry forward into Aquarius. Now, there is something you specifically need to understand about this transition. Everyone on the planet is affected by a collective nodal change, but the way it manifests personally depends upon your individual astrological configuration. If you know your rising sign, that is where the interpretation becomes more precise, because the rising sign determines which houses the lunar nodes activate within your birth chart. If you are an Aries rising, this cycle moves you away from isolated creative pursuits and toward collaborative networks and collective causes. The lesson is no longer simply about what you can create independently. It becomes about what can happen when your creative force connects with people who share a larger purpose. If you are a Cancer rising, the focus shifts toward releasing your grip on personal financial security and becoming more open to shared resources and deeper emotional vulnerability. The challenge is learning that security does not always come from controlling everything you personally possess. Sometimes intimacy requires trust, mutual support, and a willingness to share what you previously protected. If you are a Leo rising, the transition becomes deeply personal. The North Node moving through your first house asks you to reconsider how much of your identity has been organized around yourself as the center of the story, and it pushes you toward learning the art of equitable partnership. The lesson is not to erase yourself. It is to stop assuming that every relationship must revolve around your needs, your identity, or your direction. And if you are an Aquarius rising, this is an especially significant moment for you. With the North Node entering your first house, you are being called toward radical self-actualization. This means ending the habit of constantly deferring to partners, stopping the pattern of accommodating everyone else at your own expense, and taking complete ownership of your identity and your path. The invitation is to become more fully yourself without requiring permission from anyone else. No matter what your rising sign is, the deeper mission remains consistent. Release the ego's demand to be the star, and discover the power that becomes available when your individual gifts contribute to something larger. This is a crossroads. Let that idea settle for a moment, because today is not merely another item on an astrological calendar. It represents a threshold, and a threshold only becomes meaningful when you choose to cross it. For 19 months, the universe has been dismantling old defenses, old identities, and old methods of hiding behind perfectionism and control. 5 days ago, the total solar eclipse intensified that process by confronting the ego through Leo. Today, the symbolic architecture for the next chapter begins to appear through the nodal shift into Aquarius. But architecture does not build itself. A blueprint only becomes a structure when someone decides to act upon it. You are being confronted with a choice. Will you continue performing? Will you continue protecting an image? Will you continue measuring your worth according to how many people notice you, praise you, validate you, or watch what you do? Or will you step into something larger, something that can possess tremendous value even when your name is not written across the front of it? This is the truth many people may resist during this cycle. Individuals, institutions, and structures that refuse to evolve can encounter increasing pressure as the collective direction changes. Those who cling to the spotlight while refusing to participate meaningfully in the network around them may experience the friction of becoming outdated. The universe does not need to argue with an ego. It simply redirects the path around whatever refuses to move. But those who choose contribution over applause can experience an entirely different current. Those who bring their creativity, warmth, courage, and individuality into service of something larger may discover that real sovereignty was never about being constantly admired. It was about having the freedom to contribute without needing applause as proof that the contribution mattered. That is where the power of this transition becomes personal. Today, the compass changes. And as the compass changes, you are invited to change with it. The next 18 months may not resemble the life you have known before. Patterns that once felt permanent may begin losing their authority. People you assumed would always remain may move in different directions. Even your definition of success may change as you realize that some achievements looked impressive from the outside but never truly felt like yours on the inside. Yet beyond this transition is another possibility. A life that does not merely appear successful to other people, but actually feels authentic when you are alone with yourself. That kind of fulfillment cannot be measured by applause, visibility, status, or the size of an audience. It is the feeling of knowing that the life you are building is real, that your contribution matters beyond your personal image, and that your individuality has found a meaningful place within something larger. If you have stayed with this message until now, thank you for giving it your attention. If this content resonated with you and you want to continue exploring these astrological shifts, consider subscribing. Your support helps this channel continue creating more content for you. And if you've already felt these changes within your own life, share your experiences and thoughts in the comments, because your story may help someone else recognize what they are experiencing too. Until next time, take care of yourself. Stay open to what this new chapter is revealing. And remember that sometimes the greatest transformation begins when you finally stop asking to be seen and start asking what you can help build.